Okay, just for those who don't know you, my name's Georgia Henry, and I am from Reid. Our company is organisation culture consultants, and we specialise in assessing, designing and improving organisation culture. Today's webinar is around assessing the impact of culture and how we do that through our culture audit process. And so these webinars are about 30 minutes, so we go through a fair amount of information reasonably quickly. If you've got any questions at all, as I said, please put those into the chat function and I'll get to those, if not through the webinar, certainly at the end. So what we're going to cover through today is firstly, why measure culture? Why is that an important thing to do? Looking at the impact of culture, the culture audit process, and going through some examples of the data and the interpretation that we have when we do a culture audit. And then also looking at the assessment of risks and the value of culture audits, because there's a really high value to be placed on understanding your organisation culture. When we talk to many people about organisation culture, we get a variety of responses. Sometimes we hear, you know, we get a feel for culture by walking around. That was actually comments that I've heard from directors and from the AICD Essential Directors Update last year. We heard that saying, you know, directors should get a sense for culture for walking around. And you can certainly get some anecdotal gut feelings, but it doesn't actually give you the data that you need for understanding and improving culture. I hear a lot from employers as well that we already do an annual employee engagement survey and that's enough. An engagement survey really looks at how employees are feeling at a point of time, but they don't look at the impact of culture and how that's relevant, basing it back to strategy and governance and risk, and the importance of being able to manage that. We also hear things that, you know, it's not that important for us to focus on. Our business is fine. We work well within our business. So the impact of culture, what we're really looking at with culture is the results and the risks and the competitive advantage that can be gained from managing culture. And this is really important to understand. It's not about employee engagement. It's actually about having an impact in the business. And when we talk about the results, we're talking about both the financial results, the non-financial results, the organisation's ability to achieve strategic goals, to look at the impact on business metrics and provide a return on investment on any culture activities that are being undertaken. The risks presented by culture are many. We see a lot of organisations that appear on the front page of newspapers for the wrong reasons, generally cite culture as a reason for their downfall. But the risks of poor culture or toxic culture or culture that's not being optimised can be financial risks, legal or compliance risks, certainly reputation damage, which can be significant and difficult to recover from. It could be operational or quality risks, product recall risks, the sustainability of your business, being able to actually respond to external pressures and manage those. And market and customer risks, and certainly safety and well-being. So managing results and risks are an essential part of having a positive culture and being proactive in managing culture and the impact of your culture. And the third area is around competitive advantage. And that's what sets your organisation apart from others. That's your internal culture, the way that you do things. And that can be around your organisation's ability to attract and retain talent, to be able to respond quickly to change, particularly important in times where there is a lot of external disruption or the need to change quickly. Your culture can really set you apart in your ability to be able to manage and respond to change effectively. It also impacts your organisation's ability to innovate and disrupt, to add value to customers and to deliver a customer experience that is aligned to your brand values, your organisation values. And it provides you your uniqueness. So organisation culture should be unique to your organisation. It's like the personality of your organisation that enables the way things are done and the results that you get. So the impact in culture, when we do a culture audit, we are looking at the impact on results. We conduct risk assessments and we're looking at that uniqueness, what gives you that competitive advantage. So if you've watched some of our other webinars, you'd be aware of this model. This is our Henry Reid model of organisational effectiveness. I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, except to just point out those four elements of organisational effectiveness. The first one is foundation of identity, and that's around purpose and vision and values. And really looking at, when we do an assessment of culture, we look at that purpose, vision and values, and whether then they are linked through to strategy, governance and risk, which is the framework for action. That's the place where CEOs and directors like to play. And then how it's impacting on the environment for success, which is heavily influenced by leaders. And then that final outside ring is engagement, accountability and alignment. Not only is that for employees, but that's for all stakeholders and people who engage with your business, whether they might be business partners, customers, suppliers. What you're looking to do is, with organisational effectiveness, is make sure that the impact of your culture flows right through all of those elements to deliver the results, to mitigate risks and provide you with your competitive advantage. We did a webinar on this a few weeks ago. You can access that from our website at henryreid.com.au if you're interested in more information on that. But the reason I want to explain that model, because that has influenced the way we've developed our culture audit. And our culture audit is a 5-step process that I'm going to run through today and talk to you about in a little bit more detail, giving some specific examples of the data that we use and how we interpret that, linking it back to organisational effectiveness. So our first element is surveys. Surveys are a very effective online way to gather information that's unbiased. We do a business metrics review and a document review, because that allows us then to really look at that strategy, governance and risk elements, and where are the gaps? Does the framework for action actually support the type of culture that you need in your business to mitigate risk and deliver results? We then do interviews and focus groups, which give us the opportunity to deep dive into the data that we've found, to be able to discover unwritten ground rules. What are the things that may not be obvious but are happening within the business that certainly impact the way things are done? Risk, we do a risk assessment because that helps us be able to prioritise the recommendations. It helps organisations understand the importance of the certain recommendations or the findings of a culture audit, and to be able to then allocate resources effectively as well. And the final stage is a presentation of a report and recommendations. So we can go through each one of these areas fairly briefly today in this webinar. But the first one is surveys, and this is different to an engagement survey. It probably covers off a lot of questions that you might do an engagement survey. And when we start working with a new client, we do ask whether they've got engagement survey data, because we don't want to do survey overload with employees either. And if there's information that we can already use, then we can certainly customise what we provide so that we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not putting people through unnecessary data gathering. But our surveys are approximately 70 questions. They're statement-based, with a variety of answers being either multiple choice. Some allow for comments when we really want to get a feeling for what's happening, or allow people to express larger thoughts around those particular areas, and some of them are open-ended for that reason as well. Our surveys are all customised, and that's really important because they need to be values aligned to the organisation. They need to use the language of the organisation, whether that is how you refer to employees, or whether you're a club or a company or a business. So it's really important that we actually use the language for engagement with survey respondents, and that it represents the business issues. So the surveys are all customisable. And sometimes we do multiple surveys, which means we might have one directed at a board level, an executive leader level, employee level. We did one for an NRL club last year, which also had a player group and a coaching group involved. So it was, we customised those to the different levels within the business. One of the things that is unique about the way that we survey on culture is that we also include a section on culture descriptors. And we use 32 culture descriptors, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail shortly. But they are really insightful in showing the culture strengths and weaknesses, and at different levels of the organisation, what the impression of culture is. So our surveys take about 10 to 12 minutes to complete. So they're not onerous, but the insights and the information we get is invaluable. And as an example, this is one of the survey questions, treated with fairness and respect. So in this survey example, when we get the results, we have the results in a strongly agree, neither agree or disagree, and disagree and strongly disagree. So what we do when we start to analyse results is we start to look at the positive and negative. So the strongly agree and agree get combined together, and the disagree, strongly disagree get combined together. And we get a graph that looks like this, which is the three elements. Now, when we have 70 questions, what we need to do is try and highlight where the key issues are using this data. And so we look for positivity of response. So this question has a 66% positive response rate. So when we start to look at all the responses, either by position or geographic regions, or however the client is requiring the data, we actually start to look at the level of positivity, and between 55 and 69% positive response actually would get us an orange response rate there, because it's not at a really high positive response rate in the business. When we start to collate the data, we get something that looks a little bit like this. So we have the survey questions. So the survey questions down the side, so we can see what the issue is. We understand how many people have responded. And in this example, it was by position. So it was, board level, regional managers level, different levels within the organisation. And we can start to have a look by each question. What is the type of positivity, the level of positivity of response? Where are the key issues, and particularly where there might be a group that is having a certain number of issues? So for starting to analyse the survey data, it can become very clear and very visually clear quickly where the key issues are. And when we're using that survey data then to move on to the next step of the focus groups and the interviews, we know the areas that we want to do a bit more of a deep dive on. So the survey analysis for us is always fascinating, because it becomes quite obvious where some of the key issues are that require further investigation. Now, as I mentioned before, we have the 32 culture descriptors. This is an example of a few of them. So we have a sliding scale. It's a fixed point sliding scale. And this is in each of the survey questions. Our culture can be described as. And we ask respondents to actually choose what is their culture most like, whether it's on the more negative side or the more positive side. So for example, blaming or accountable, reactive or proactive, siloed or collaborative. And what we do by looking at these scores is we can actually start to get a real feel for the indicators of culture within the organisation. Now, to give you some examples of what this looks like, once we've compiled the data, this is a client of ours from last year, and we had 3 levels that we measured. So we looked at the board, executive managers and employees across these culture descriptors. So I don't have the descriptors in there, but you can see at the top here, we would have the more positive descriptor. So for example, accountable, and at the bottom, the negative indicator, which is blaming. The interesting thing when we start to look at this data is that you can see that all levels of the organisation actually follow a similar trend, but you've got varying levels of positivity happening. When I presented this to the board on the completion of this culture audit, the board comment actually was, we think we must be living in fairyland. We see the organisation as so much more positive than the employees, which is that blue line, and the executives and managers, which is the orange line. And one of the most telling things in this organisation, when we started to go through all the culture audit information, was the significant disconnect from the board view about organisation culture and the executives and managers who are managing the culture. And also that, interestingly, that the employees were in the middle. So this data, when we start to look at the descriptors, is really insightful. Another example, we did this for an organisation where it was really strongly regionalised. So many geographic regions were represented, and we also wanted to look at the trends by position. So you can look at this graph on the left. When it's by region, you'll notice the thick red line, that's the trend, that's the average. It's the same there when we look at it by position. But when we start to break it down by region, we can see that some regions are above the line, some below. Same with positions. Some are above the line, some are below. What this means when we start to analyse and break things down by individual region, we can start to see where things are quite positive and maybe there needs to be some further investigation. This also helps when looking at validation of data and the creation of focus groups and interviews as to where we might need to target to dig a little deeper. Now, these culture descriptors are also used to look at the negative indicators of culture as opposed to the positive indicators of culture. So in the negative indicators for this particular organisation, the indicators were controlled, disorganised, siloed, reactive and stagnant. And the 5 highest descriptors were ethical, trusted, honest, encourages diversity and inclusive. So one of the things that tells us too, because when we look at culture, we look at operational issues, we look at behavioural issues, and we look at feelings and emotions in the context of that organisational effectiveness model. When we look at the negative areas here that are being described by the participants of the culture audit, these predominantly relate to operational issues, and operational issues are much easier to fix than negative behavioural issues. And we look at the 5 highest rated descriptors here as the positive indicators of culture, and they're really, really encouraging, ethical, trusted, honest. These are difficult to actually create within a culture, and you have an organisation in this case that had those, but things weren't working well. The culture had actually become quite negative because of a lot of operational issues in that framework around that we need to work around. So to help us at this early stage of doing a culture audit, as well as doing this survey and gathering that data, we do a business metrics and document review. And this focuses on those first 2 elements of the model of organisational effectiveness: purpose, vision and values, and governance, strategy and risk. And this shows us whether there is strong alignment to the purpose, vision and values, and how that's reflected through the results, the risks, and providing competitive advantage. So in the document review, some of the things we would look at are, does their purpose, vision and values exist? Are they actively used within the organisation? Are they embedded in systems and processes? What does the organisation's code of conduct look at? Policies, the strategic plan, are the strategic results being delivered? We look at things like position descriptions and performance management frameworks because they guide behaviours and they also guide the delivery of results. We look at risk statements and registers, internal and external complaints. We look at employee value proposition and demonstration of compliance. So to do this, we can do this securely online. We work with our clients. We have an online portal where we have established a specific secure client portal. And so any document uploads or things that we are working with our clients remain secure and confidential. These are not the types of documents you want flying back and forward by email. We also look at the business metrics, so what's currently being measured within the business and the change in results sort of year on year, because we can start to look at the trends and where those trends may support what we're finding through the survey data or the document review. So the types of things that we would be looking at are things like productivity figures, revenue dollars per full-time equivalent employee. It could be employee engagement scores that you already have within the business, turnover figures, injuries, claims cost, even customer net promoter scores to show how the organisation is being able to deliver from the internal culture to the external expectations. And then we move on to the interviews and focus groups. And as I said, these give us the opportunity for a deep dive and to validate the data that we've gathered. They are targeted questions and activities based on the findings that we have from the surveys and the business metrics and document review. They give us an opportunity to get qualitative data and feedback. We do a lot of customised activities to be able to encourage people to share that with us. We do polls for further insights, and we look at the alignment back with that culture framework and that organisational effectiveness model. So what we find generally when we start to do this deep dive into this qualitative data is that there's three key areas we look at. What are operational issues? What are based on feelings and emotions? And what are the behaviours that are being observed within the business that might be impacting on culture? And the reason things tend to fall into these three areas is because we find operational issues are easy to identify. They can create a lot of feeling and emotion. So if you think about being frustrated with a system or a process that doesn't work, or the responsiveness of a particular team, that creates a feeling and emotion with someone, which will then impact the way that they behave, whether they behave appropriately or inappropriately. So these three things are really key for us to identify what are operational issues, what are feelings and emotions, and what are behaviours, because we can manage behaviours and we can change operational issues, and we can have that really positive impact through monitoring and managing the culture of the organisation. With the feelings and emotions, what we look at there is the drivers for those feelings and emotions, but also the impact of leaders. And as something additional that we do with our clients is we look at emotional intelligence assessing of leaders, because being able to understand the impact of operational issues, which could include decisions being made, changes being implemented, the way things are being addressed, being able to understand the impact on feelings and emotions has a significant impact on the behaviours of employees, again resulting in that culture impact. How are results being achieved? how are risks being mitigated, and what's providing our competitive advantage. So these interviews and focus groups, as I said, it's that qualitative data. Some examples are from interviews, we tend to find that we get an enormous amount of honesty. So these are some comments that came from executive interviews with one of our clients. And the executives really started to think through these issues, to start to look at, when they're presented with the culture indicators graphs as part of the interviews, why is that happening? And we find that we get an incredible amount of honesty and openness, because we're independent, we're not part of the organisation, and the results that we pull together are compiled results. So there is anonymity in the responsiveness, and people share information with us that they're less likely to share within the organisation, because there's no fear of repercussions. And so we find that we get a huge amount of feedback through the interview and focus group process. And another example is where we need to look at perhaps conducting further polls. So this was with an organisation where the comments in the survey mentioned bullying, mentioned inappropriate behaviours, mentioned behaviour that didn't align with values. So as part of the focus groups, we did an additional poll, which was, have you witnessed bullying? 83% said yes. Do you know what to do? And resounding, more than 80% again said yes. But is it being managed effectively? Almost everyone said no. So then we can start to have a look at digging further. Is that an operational issue, which it is when it's not being managed effectively, but it's also a behavioural issue, because these behaviours are being enabled or allowed to happen. So we can really start to look at the impact of this. The feelings and emotions tied up with that issue were, as I'm sure you could understand, quite significant. So being able to run these focus groups and interviews allows us to dig further into the issues that were identified through surveys, business metrics, and the documents. The fourth stage in our process is a risk assessment. And we hear about risk assessments being done for safety issues, but risk assessment and managing risk of culture is incredibly important. Majority of risk within organisations comes from within. It's around the behaviours. Do people choose to do the right thing or the wrong thing? Are they following procedures? Are they acting ethically? Are they being compliant? Are they following your standards and your operational procedures and practices? So this is really heavily tied up with what we do. We assess the likelihood of something happening, one of those risks we've identified occurring, and the significance of impact. It's important for executives and boards to understand the risk associated with the findings of culture, or the culture risks, because they cover off on so many different areas. This is an example. Our risk assessment's quite complex. This is just a really high-level example with a client that we worked with recently. And we found that the key driver behind a lot of these culture risks was actually around compliance and had a legal impact. The flow on from that was financial, reputation damage, and the safety and well-being of employees. And then more subtly, but still a risk, was a strategic risk. Could they actually deliver their strategic objectives? It was a risk that this would be damaged because of the culture. Also a sustainability of business risk and a quality of delivery of product and services. So a risk assessment is essential in being able to identify the impact of the findings of a culture audit, and allows boards and executive teams then to prioritise and allocate resources to being able to resolve that. The final stage is the report and recommendations. And we find boards and CEOs find this absolutely invaluable, because it is independent and unbiased. As we showed in that graph with the culture indicators, the board and that organisation thought things were going really well. However, the reality of what's happening with that executive manager team and that disconnect, the board was unaware because the information was not being filtered up to the board. So having the independent, unbiased information through a culture audit actually provides boards and CEOs information about how they can manage risk, because they bear the brunt of all the risk of culture. And if they don't actually understand what's happening, they are exposed and unable to actually fix the issues. So the report and the recommendations that we provide with it are validated. They're supported by data. We provide the comprehensive insights, and those risks are identified. We always recommend that a board take the information that we provide and the risks assessment that we do, and then follow through with their own, to ensure that with their knowledge of the whole organisation, how are those things prioritised, and what are those actions that are going to take from the recommendations. And the recommendations and the report with the risk assessment actually builds that business case for change, because we use the business metrics. We can actually show where the improvements in results are going to occur. So just summing up, I know that's a fairly quick overview, but we're half an hour in already. If you've got any questions, please put them into the chat function, and I'm happy to answer those. But just in summary, the value of doing a culture audit, as I said, it's not an engagement survey. There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding about what an engagement survey is and what a culture audit is. But the value of a culture audit is that it provides validated understanding of your culture's strengths and their potential to actually drive things better, to improve results, mitigate risks, and provide that competitive advantage. Because quite often culture strengths aren't understood and they're not optimized. They're not actually used to advantage of the business. The culture audit also will identify where your culture weaknesses are, and the limitations and the risks associated with your culture. So you can work on that you use the culture audit as a management tool to be able to develop strategy, to be able to make the improvements and changes that you need. It can really identify where that gap is between the current reality of culture, based on an independent and unbiased review, and what your desired culture needs to be. And particularly in times of change, we've all been going through significant change that's been forced upon us. How is your culture actually able to support the achievement of change, the ability for your business to pivot, the ability for your business to be able to maintain sustainability? It provides clarity on risks and priorities and how these impact strategy, and it gives you that business case for implementing change with a return on investment. So we look at, again, the results, the risk, and the competitive advantage that comes from the ways that you manage culture. And aligned with that is when we start to improve the benefits of culture, we start to see it in the figures, we start to have tangible return on investment. And with the improvements come those cost reductions as well. So we see things like changes in employee turnover, changes in costs of claims or labour costs, improvements in productivity. So a culture audit really is insightful for helping your organisation be able to focus strategically on achieving results through the people within your business and creating that competitive advantage. So I'm starting to see some questions come through. I'm going to have a look. Keith's asked a couple of questions. So is there a minimum number of participants required to develop a meaningful and reliable assessment? Great question, Keith. We don't recommend a culture audit for every organisation. So one of the companies that we worked with or are working with now, but approached us last year to do a culture audit and had less than 50 participants as employees. We worked with them and we did a discovery consultation and decided that they didn't need a full culture audit. So for a full culture audit, it works really effectively with organisations, perhaps over 50. The most we've done is up to over 1,000 employees. There's really no limit to the amount of people we can have. But we would ensure that the culture audit is the best option for giving you a return on investment. So there are other things that we can look through as part of our culture design and culture change process for smaller businesses that may work. Would this work for a dysfunctional board for review? Absolutely, there are elements that can be looked at for a dysfunctional board in particular. When we start to look at the elements of that purpose, vision, values, the alignment of strategy, governance and risk, the environment that's being created, and where those issues are. So we can customise the way we do things to ensure that we're delivering results. Another question from Jane. How does the board ensure it has effective oversight of organisation culture? What metrics give directors visibility? Great question, Jane. And this is where, as I said, that example I had where the board and the executive leaders were very disconnected. Information was not flowing through the CEO to the board. There's a number of reasons why information might be filtered. There may not be any maliciousness or intent, but sometimes information is filtered as it goes to a board. So it's around understanding what are the metrics that are important for your organisation to be measuring, monitoring change in some of those indicators. So some key indicators for me that they might be a red flag around changes indicating a culture issue might be a change in productivity. So that might be revenue dollars per full-time equivalent employee. If that's changed and can't be explained by business change, an increase in employee turnover, an increase in internal complaints. When you start to see some of those business metrics shifting, it might be an indicator that there's a problem. So directors wear all the risk of culture. They need to ensure that they're getting an accurate view of what's happening. And that's where the benefit of an independent culture audit can give that reassurance as well. Thanks. Oh, Andre said, thank you. Thanks, Andre. Glad you could join us. Does anyone have any other questions that you'd like to ask at this time? Not seeing anything else get typed in. What I'd like to do is to offer you, if this is something that might be of interest with your organisation, is to contact us to do a return on investment discovery consultation. That is a process we go through to make sure a culture audit's actually going to give you the value for your organisation. So if you're interested in that, please give me a call or contact us via our website, email me. Happy to take any calls and answer any questions further. And if you're interested in the questions, oh, actually we've got another question that's come through from Sarah. What's your experience in quantitative behaviour evaluations to measure impact over an extended period of time? For example, change within individuals, change within teams, change in ops, and at an organisation external levels. I think quantitative behaviour evaluations need to be validated with qualitative data. So for me, if you're just looking at a measure, a quantitative measure, you need to be able to interpret that effectively. So Sarah, I'd be saying if there's changes in quantitative behaviour evaluations over time, you need to actually deep dive and understand why that is. What are the drivers? As I said, you know, there's quite a number of different things impacting behaviours. operational issues, the feelings and emotions, the impact of leadership, looking at organisational effectiveness, that framework for action. So I would be saying that those things need to be deep dived further, and that's something that we can certainly assist with. So Kelly's put up in the chat function as well a link there where you can book a discovery consultation with me. I would love you to reach out if there's anything I can do to assist. And I really thank you for joining us for this webinar. I hope you enjoy your day and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.